Let's look at this, verse 33. It says, now when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And there's something I want to bring up because it's something that I hear critics and skeptics say often whenever there's things like this in the Gospels, and they go, why doesn't anyone else mention that? Right? The Bible has this event, and you think, wow, you have the sky turning dark? Big deal. Think someone's going to notice whenever it's middle of the day and the sky goes dark? Think that'll catch some attention? And so skeptics will say, well, then why doesn't anyone else mention it? Why is it only the gospel writer who tells us the sky went dark? Surely something of that magnitude someone else would have noticed and written about it. I hear this not only with this event, with several other ones. Next week we'll talk about where the tombs open up and people come out, raised from the dead, and they'll say, well, why didn't anybody else mention that? Or I've heard them mention it about the Herod and the killing of all the children in Bethlehem under the age of 2. And they say, well, why doesn't anyone else mention that? Something to consider. Should we consider it amazing or strange or odd that someone else did not write about it? I don't think we should. And here's a few reasons. First, maybe they did. You realize that about 70 to 80% of all the things that we know of that were written back then are gone. Things we know were written that aren't around anymore. First, 2,000 years ago, the material that writing is done on is very fragile. It doesn't tend to last that long. There's a reason why the very earliest things we have to be like sealed and kept in special protection, because they will crumble. They're very fragile things. So it actually makes sense that we wouldn't have much, and we know we don't have much. There are things that we know for a fact were written we don't have anymore. Like, for instance, we know from, I believe it's 2 Corinthians and from Philippians, that Paul wrote more letters to those churches. He references, hey, this other time I wrote you. Well, we don't have that letter, but we know he wrote it. There are other historians will quote something, and they'll say, oh, in the history of whatever, so-and-so said. So we know that that person wrote something. We don't have it. So there's things we know exist that we don't have. What is there that we don't know about that wouldn't be around anymore? So it's entirely possible other people noticed and other people wrote about it, and we just don't have it anymore. Second, it's not actually reasonable to assume that people would actually write about it. That's us looking back saying, wow, that's such a big deal. Surely somebody would have written about it. But that's our thinking. Literacy was actually quite low back then. And it wasn't horribly uncommon, but it was quite low. A lot of people could not read and write. And so you wouldn't actually write a whole bunch of stuff just to write it. If you're writing for a specific purpose, for a specific audience, and you're going to address only what you need to address. Plus, you're not. They weren't making books. They had scrolls, and you only have so much space on there, so you're only going to include what you need to include. Historians, they wrote with a purpose and they had a goal, and it may not include things that we think just because we think it maybe should. A lot of these things, historians would be in a far-off region. Maybe they didn't actually experience what happened, so they're not writing about it. But there's also the fact that we have plenty of examples of things where historians did not write down something that it seems obvious they would have. Marco Polo. You know Marco Polo? Not the game, where you blindfold, Marco, right? Not that. The Marco Polo traveled to China, right, and wrote about his experiences and what he saw. Do you know he never mentions the Great Wall? How do you go to China and miss a giant wall? Never mentions it. Columbus, upon returning from discovering the New World, returns to a hero's welcome in Barcelona. Parade and party. It's not mentioned in the official city archives. Well, that's strange. I think they would have brought that up. Richard Grafton is a historian. He writes about the reign of King John of England. Never says a word about the Magna Carta. Wow. As far as we're concerned, that's a cornerstone historic event and document. Never mentions it. Roman historian Dio Cassius mentions that the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. But Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the eruption himself and who had an uncle who lived in one of those towns, doesn't mention it. So just because we think they should record it doesn't actually mean that they thought they needed to. So it shouldn't be strange at all. However, we actually do have other records that appear to reference the sky going dark when Jesus was crucified. In the first century, you have two different historians, Thallus and Plagon, who both write in the first century, and they describe that the sky went dark, and they try to explain why. And I think it's Thallus that says it was an eclipse. Of course, one of the problems is there was no eclipse around that time. And then later in the 3rd century, you have historian Julius Africanus, who is referring to those two historians and actually explaining they missed it. This was about Jesus. So actually, outside of the Bible, we do have records about the sky going dark.